Hi, friends. So, recently I was scanning Amazon Prime Day deals, trying to find some new arts and craft supplies to try, which is honestly really hard because I already have a lot of stuff. But I did find something that I don't already have, and that was these Crayola watercolor crayons. I didn't even know watercolor crayons existed. I've heard of watercolors and watercolor pencils, but I have never heard of watercolor crayons. So, I thought we'd try them. This set comes with 12 colors, a clear mixing palette, instructions, and a brush. The crayons themselves feel sort of like a mix between a regular wax crayon and an oil pastel. The brush feels very stiff and sort of plasticky, even though it looks soft. I know next to nothing about watercolor, and I think it feels like a crappy brush. So I'm not going to use that brush, but I am going to swatch these out. I'm going to try a few different methods of swatching them because the instructions list a few different ways of using them, and since I don't know anything about these, I'm going to try them all. First, I tested just drawing on the paper with them like a crayon. Obviously, I don't think this is the recommended usage for them. They're very crumbly, and even though the color is opaque and bright, the finish is not very watercolory, and it would obviously transfer onto everything it touched. But that was just to see what the color looked like undiluted. The next swatch was using the crayon to put the color onto the paper, then using water to activate it and pull it across the page. Again, it is very crumbly, so I had to be really careful to try and blow the crumbs off the page and not swipe them with my hands or I'd get smears everywhere. The colors are still looking pretty, but you can still see where the crayon was and it's not dissolving fully. I tried using the stiffer Crayola brush to sort of scrub at the area where the crayon was and really work to dissolve it, but it really just chewed up the paper. And this is watercolor paper, I promise. For the next swatch, I used the method of drawing on the mixing palette with the crayons, then activating it with water and painting it onto the paper. I'm a little confused because sometimes the crayons will go on nice and thick, and sometimes they don't mark the palette at all. It seemed like when that happened, if I just changed the side or the angle of the crayon, then it would work. I don't really understand that, so if anyone has an explanation, I would love to know. At least on the palette though, you can use the crumbles to mix into your wet color. The color does look very light when you paint it onto the paper, but it also looks very even. Next, I'm going to try using a wet brush to swipe some color off of the crayon and then paint it onto the paper. I really tried to scrub at the crayon and work to give it time to activate, but I honestly don't know if it made a difference. The color is darker, but you can see the brush strokes a bit more. I also discovered it is very easy to splatter paint if you get a little too aggressive scrubbing at the crayon. Whoops. The last thing I'm going to test is dipping the crayon into water and then drawing on the page. This was suggested in their instructions. The sort of confusing thing is that their instructions specifically say not to put water on the paper and then draw with the crayons because that could tear the paper. But that's basically what this felt like doing. The water doesn't really dissolve the crayon when it's on it, it just sort of sits on there. So when I dip the crayon and then put it on the paper, it really just sort of makes a puddle that I'm then drawing in, and that softens the crayon. I don't know if that made sense. Either way, after it's dry, the color still feels thick and waxy and obviously still transfers. I did also try blending colors a couple of different ways. First by putting two colors next to each other and then using water to try and blend them, and that looks like butt. And then I tried mixing the colors on the palette and painting with them. That looks smoother, but I'm not actually sure if I was going for a gradient or just a new color. So yeah. Also, yes, I did swatch white. Why? I don't know, I can't see it. It's like when my preschoolers first try to draw with a white crayon on white paper and they think that it's broken. After all of the colors are dry, I can see pros and cons to all of the methods. Some are more opaque and some are really sheer. Some are more even, and some show a lot more brushstrokes. So I guess I'm going to have to test with some actual art. So the first thing I'm going to try is using the crayons to draw on the paper and then going in with water to melt it and smooth it out. and the idea for the art is not my idea. It's something I've seen all over the internet, but it's an easy enough design. Although, admittedly, I should have sketched out the design, or at least the spacing. This is already looking bad. I'm trying different shapes inside to fill each blob. I don't want to fill them in completely since the crayon will melt and cover more, but I'm also not sure if it'll leave lines underneath where I drew. There are so many crumbles, so I'm trying to be really careful and not get them mixed into the other colors. Then I took water on a brush and started working slowly at each blob. I focused on really activating as much of the crayon as I could to hopefully hide the lines, and then I worked on spreading it around evenly. And the process of this was so relaxing. Something about focusing on each section, working the medium, and then evening everything out. It was like I could feel my heart rate going down and my body calming. After everything was dry, there are a few places that you can see the lines, but it's not terrible. And a little bit of the color transfers onto my fingers still, but it's really negligible. So the finishing touches to this piece are going to be little faces, because these are ghosts. Very fun ghosts. Can you imagine being haunted by a neon green blob? Okay, maybe that wouldn't be fun, but I'll take the red one. She looks cool. Using the crayons directly on paper and then activating them obviously worked pretty well. There is a little bit of line showing through, but mostly they blended out nicely. I would definitely try this method again with abstract or large cartoony art. For the next painting I'm going to use the crayons on the palette and then activate them with water to paint. You can't see it, but there is a sketch on this page. It's a cat wearing a witch hat from the coloring book Just Add Spooky by my friend Anchored Art Designs. Obviously, these are all going to be Halloween themed. Painting this, I started by using a light brown on the hat as a sort of tone, but you'll see as I go on that I obviously don't have a clear plan. I know with watercolors that I'll have to work in layers, but part of the reason that I don't usually work much with watercolor is that I'm really impatient when it comes to waiting for things to dry. Normally, when I'm working on an art piece, I'll just keep working until I hit a point where I'm not sure what to do anymore. Then I'll take a break and think about it. But with watercolor, you can't just keep working and working. You have to stop and wait for it to dry. So I tried to move on to other areas and keep going, but the areas can't be touching or the colors bleed, which happened a little bit with the cat's ears. The colors that I chose for this painting clearly needed to be a little more thought out. Probably should have done a different color cat. Like, a black cat is very Halloween-y, but it's not the most interesting painting to have a black cat wearing a black hat. Or, I guess I could have gone with a purple hat. Either way, it's pretty obvious that I did not have a clear idea ahead of starting to paint, since I started with brown undertones for the hat, then went in with black, before eventually going over it with purple. I painted the eyes in with black and then tried to go over them later with green. Listen, I know that it doesn't make sense. I was just going for it, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Another thing that I did not plan out ahead of time was what style I wanted for this painting. Did I want smooth blends or did I want more loose shapes? I think because of that, I struggled to see the whole painting as I was working. Like, watching this back in editing, I think the hat was looking pretty good at first, but I was so focused on each stroke and whether the shape looked how I wanted, whether it fit in next to the color next to it, and I wasn't even looking at that section as a whole. I did that with the whole painting, so I just kept working areas and adding more layers, and it just keeps getting darker and losing its dimension. Now, I know that certain problems I'm running into could also be corrected by using a different product, but that's not the point of me trying these out. I'm not aiming for fine art or even something that I would sell or give away. I'm just trying these out for anyone else like me who just wants to play around with watercolor, even if they have no actual knowledge of techniques or anything. I'm more just testing these out to see if they're easy to use and fun for novices like me. So after the painting was done, it doesn't look awful. I mean, it does look like a cat wearing a witch's hat, but I didn't want to leave it like this, not if I could fix it a bit. So I went over it with some colored pencils. Okay, the fur, let's just not talk about it. I mean, we can, but I already know it's a mess. Fur is just something I have not figured out yet. I do think that ultimately the pencils helped and it looks better. It's just still not great. I'm glad that I still have the original page untouched in the coloring book so that I can eventually do her justice. The last detail I added to this painting was to add some stars to the hat and the cape. There were stars in the original drawing, and I thought it would just add a little something so that it isn't black on black on black. I also added them to the cape so that it maybe looks like an actual cape and not a weird purple stripe. So, besides the ill-thought-out choices I made with this piece, I do think the crayons performed just fine from the palette. It was a little more work than I wanted to do to keep scribbling on the palette all the time because the color didn't really go that far, but that might be user error. So, for my test taking color off the crayon with a brush, I'm doing another picture from Just Add Spooky. With how much of a novice I am at watercolor and how much I didn't know about these crayons, I just didn't want to add having to come up with and sketch a picture. Plus, I just really wanted to do more pages from this book. So I used a light pad to trace the picture onto some watercolor paper. For the first layer on this picture, I'm still using my method of using a lot of water to try and really activate the crayon and get a lot of color. And it's not working, obviously. You can barely even see it on camera. So seeing that, I knew that this was going to take a lot of layers to build up, so I settled in and, spoiler alert, it all works out nicely in the end. I did have a better idea going in of what colors I wanted to use, and they're also much brighter. No black on black on black here. This painting took by far the longest out of any of them, but it's actually my favorite because the process really forced me to learn so much about these crayons. Like, for instance, the color actually comes out much darker when the crayon is more on the dry side. Now, in hindsight, that seems like common sense because less water means the color is less diluted, but at the time, I figured more water would cause more activation. No. I also learned that if the crayon is too dry, the color doesn't blend well on the paper. So you have to find that kind of sweet spot between pigment and being able to move the color around. I also figured out how to keep adding colors while the paper is still wet so that they melt into each other. But there comes a point where the paper is saturated enough that it just won't take any more color, and you have no choice but to wait for it to dry. And that is what made me love working on this carnivorous plant painting so much. There is no way that someone could put into words just exactly how much water to use. You could never explain to me exactly what the feel of the paper is when it's to the point where it won't take any more color. It's just something that I had to learn by doing, and I really started to get a feel for it after a while. I still had lots of struggles though. I mean, I was not having a good time trying to figure out how to differentiate areas that all needed to look different but were basically all the same color. The mouth area has lips, gums, a tongue, and the inside of the mouth area that are all basically red but different red. You know? So I experimented with adding in purple, magenta, brown, and black in different spots to try to define them. By about the third layer of painting, I figured out how to use a barely wet brush tip to get color dark enough to outline areas. And I think that really made a difference in separating the spaces and making them look much more bold. Each additional layer really added to the color and saturation. It got to the point where I wasn't worrying about building up color, but I was able to focus on small sections at a time to really perfect the blending and get them to look exactly how I wanted. Which was only really possible because of the layers before it working so well together. So I will say that the best thing I learned from this painting was patience with watercolors specifically. Like I said, I hate waiting for things to dry when I'm painting, but the patience really paid off in the end. I think ultimately I did about 5 layers on each area, but the colors blend into each other so smoothly, and they have light and dark areas, and the whole thing is so vibrant and pretty. I was really enjoying this process so much that I probably could have done another 5 layers, just adding little bits here and there, but I knew that I had to stop at some point. And while I was really afraid to screw this up, I did want to go in with colored pencils just to tweak a few things. I mostly left the green sections alone since I liked how they looked so much, but I did darken up the darkest green on the head. I just really wanted it to have more depth. And I added more lines and details to the stalk. For the mouth, I took advantage of having lots of different red pencils to really separate the areas, neaten up the shading, and to make the edges of the teeth really crisp. I already told you that this was my favorite piece out of all of them, and that it's because of the journey I went through making it. I think using the crayons in the way that I did was what caused me to learn so much, so I would definitely use this technique again. For the final painting, I'm going to try a couple of different techniques in one. First, I'm going to try these on black paper. The instructions in the pack say that laying down a white base, letting that dry, and then working over that should make the colors really pop. Second, I'm going to try dipping the crayon in water. Ooh, I didn't mean to dip it in quite that much. Well, it's really wet now, I guess. This is not from Just Add Spooky, nor am I sketching it out first. It's just a pumpkin, so I'm hoping I can manage freehand drawing that myself. I actually don't like how the color is blending with this dipping technique. You can see where the wet crayon first touches the paper that it really dilutes the crayon color. And as the crayon touches drier paper, it's darker. And you can't go over the wetter areas because the paper just won't take any more crayon at that point. I know it's just a base, but I wanted a little more even than that, so I decided to use a brush to activate the drier areas and try to spread the color around a little more evenly. I was also afraid that the less activated areas would reactivate when I went over them with darker colors and would lighten them. I mean, this kind of happened anyway, but maybe that can't be avoided. Once that dried, I decided to go in with what I would consider the highlights, adding some white and some yellow where the light would be hitting the pumpkin. Then I used a wet brush to activate and blend those. I worked in layers, adding darker colors each layer, and I did struggle keeping them from accidentally covering up the lighter colors and keeping them opaque, but that's probably not something that is possible with watercolors. At the end, I did switch to pulling color off of the crayon with the brush just to add some really dark areas on the edges, and to try and add a few small white highlight lines, which didn't end up sticking around. Ultimately though, this was a very quick little painting. And since I used a bunch of different techniques for the painting, I can't really say which was best, but I did enjoy doing it. Okay, so I know Crayola art products can be geared a little towards children and maybe aren't the best quality, but I thoroughly enjoyed using these. I would definitely recommend them for anyone that just wants to play around with watercolor or even travel with them, because besides the crumbles, they aren't very messy. So that's all for this week. What do you think? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.